Hiya Monstaz and welcome! Tonight we have 5 more funeral home stories to share with you. Some of these can be rather informational, some can be kinda gross. Do you plan on being an organ donor? Well, after hearing one of these stories, you might think twice, unless you're about that science. So be sure to hold on to your teddy and let the stories begin. You never know. It was my second day on the job. My supervisor told me I could go on the next call that came into the funeral home. Well, just then, we got the call. I was introduced to Fred. Fred was a New Yorker, about 50 years old. He had worked at the funeral home for about 12 years and had the most experience of all the removal staff. On another note, the guy was extremely vulgar, rude, annoying, and would talk non-stop, inserting curse words with about every other word he uttered. I didn't like him that much. We were assigned to go on what is referred to as a house call. House calls meant that someone had died in their home and no foul play was suspected, so the removal staff would pick up the body and bring it back to the funeral home. The protocol for the house call always required 3 removal staff to go in, since you never know what you might be walking into. People die in strange locations in their home, in strange situations and positions, and sometimes it requires 2 people to get the body. Now, oftentimes, one of the removal staff would keep the family away while the other would remove the body. Death is not a pretty thing. There's nothing comforting about seeing your loved ones scooped up, placed on a gurney or in a body bag and moved out of their home for the last time. Well, we would try to protect the family as much as possible from having to see us at work, since it could be quite a traumatic thing for many families. On one house call, a family who had gathered around their dead father's body in their home, they wouldn't allow us to take the body. They cried and screamed and fought to keep the dead man in his recliner, where he passed away. Finally, the family members giving us problems were escorted out of their home by the sheriff, who distracted them long enough for us to remove the deceased. Fred and I began our journey to a home of a 41-year-old deceased white male. Our paperwork told us the wife would be present at the home, waiting for us. I remember what Fred said to me on the way, as I listened quietly.
Okay now, I don't know who you are. I only met you today, so I don't know what experiences you got. As far as I know, you never seen a dead body. I don't know. But what we'll do when we get to the home is go in and see what we've got. You never know what you're walking into, kid. So what I like to do is go in and see where the body is. See how hard it's gonna be to get the fucking gurney in and out the door. You really don't want to be banging into the walls and hitting doors as you're rolling the goddamn body out, you know? You want to do it in a dignified way. That's why you want to see what you got first. You never know. Now, after we go in and see what the body is, we'll come back out and get the gurney. Then we'll go in and get the body. Now, you never know what the family is gonna do. They may try to hit you or keep you from taking the body. Sometimes they're fucked up. You never know. So, you have to try to figure out what they are like so you can deal with it. Shit, I've had people go crazy on me before. You just never know. You never know. As far as I know, you may go running out the door screaming since you're new at this. I never know. If you do, I'll get the body. But don't embarrass me, okay? I don't want to be embarrassed. You seem like a nice guy and seem to be in control, but you never know. So I don't know if I can trust you yet.
The conversation went on like this, with Fred repeating himself over and over and over until we finally arrived.
My confidence was increasing with each thing Fred said to me.
He was such an encourager. We did just what Fred said. We went in and met the wife of the deceased, who seemed to be in control of her emotions. She mostly looked scared. She led us into the living room where her husband sat slumped over on the couch. Rigor mortis had set in his arms and legs. They were pretty stiff. He was in a sitting position, but he had leaned a bit to the right. He was wearing green shorts and looked as though he had been relaxing watching football. Fred and I went out to the van and got the gurney. While out there, he said,
Okay, rigor mortis is set, so it might be kinda hard to get him through the door. We're gonna try to straighten him out once we get him on the gurney. You lift his legs, I'll lift his torso, and we'll get him on the gurney, then straighten him out. At this point, I was thinking, okay, straighten him out? This should be interesting.
So we went in solemnly pushing the gurney. The wife stood close by as we wrestled the man into the gurney. For some reason, both Fred and I were quite clumsy, and the man's rigor mortis was making it difficult to move him. He was quite heavy as well. Finally, we got him onto the gurney, and Fred now attempted to straighten out his legs so that we could lay him flat on the gurney. And this was a bit humorous because his legs were not going to lay flat, no matter how much Fred fought them. After making this look insensitive and unpleasant, Fred told the man's wife we would be leaving now. He placed a sheet on the man along with a blue funeral home blanket, which laid over the gurney, and we wheeled him out. I do say it looked quite strange since he was not laying very flat. It looked though as we were moving a kitchen chair under a blanket instead of a dead man. We got him to the van, popped him in the back, and we pulled away slowly. Fred began giving commentary.
You did good, kid. That rigor mortis made that one kinda hard, but you did really good. Like I said, you never know what you're gonna walk into. I didn't know if you were gonna run or what you were gonna do. I can't believe that freaking rigor mortis in his legs. Did you see the freaking rigor mortis? Damn. You never know.
That day, after working with Fred, I realized that dealing with the dead was much more pleasant than having to put up with the living. Also, I learned, you never know. Removal staff. At the funeral home where I landed a job, I was called the removal staff. I was one of about 8 people who were working in what we call the prep room. This was about a 1,200 square foot room with cinder block walls and industrial tile flooring. It was a fairly sterile room. It had contained a small, enclosed office space used by the prep room supervisor. It also had an adjoining room called the embalming room, which housed 2 very large walk-in refrigerated rooms. Now, this is where the deceased bodies were stored before their scheduled funeral. I truly wish I had taken some photos of these spaces so you can have a reference to what I'm speaking of, but hopefully you have an active imagination that can fill in the blanks. Okay, the prep room was a space where all the action took place. Here's how it worked. A removal staff person would retrieve the deceased from their home, the medical examiner's office, hospital morgues or ERs, and even the nursing home, and promptly bring them back to the outside double doors of the prep room. The bodies were transported in unmarked vans equipped for such things. Upon arrival to the prep room, I would remove all personal items such as jewelry, wallets, etc. These items would be tagged and logged, and then stored in a safe box. The deceased would receive a yellow plastic ankle tag with their name. The tag would also have a pre-printed ID number, which would be used to identify the body from here on out. The tags were not possible to remove with scissors, and would remain with the body even in burial. I would then take the body into the embalming room and either transfer them to the refrigerator storage space or place them on the embalming table. We had a system for moving bodies that made it possible for even one person to move them. Sometimes the body had to be transferred into a body-sized cardboard box to be taken across the hall to the cremation room. We would store the bodies to be cremated in a separate refrigerated room next to the cremation ovens. I call them ovens because, well, that's exactly what they reminded me of. Only they were much larger and could fit a human body lying down. Other responsibilities I had as a removal staff person was inventory of caskets for upcoming funerals, preparing the bodies for the funeral including dressing the body, placing them in the correct casket, and applying makeup and fixing their hair from time to time. Also, it was my job to load the casket containing the prepared body into my unmarked van, and this was to transport them to the funeral home chapel, where I would unload the casket, roll it into a place inside the chapel, set up the appropriate candles and flowers, open the casket and make sure the body was presentable with the correct lighting for viewing. Sometimes when a body was transferred, the makeup might smudge or glasses might get askew and need readjusting. It was very common for the upper body clothing to be re-situated before the viewing since it sometimes gets sloppy during travel. The funeral home where I worked was a large corporation in a large city. They owned 13 funeral homes in the metro city area, but all the bodies were prepared at the downtown location, which was where the prep room was, located where I worked. So, if someone died in the far north part of town, their body would still be driven to the downtown area for preparation, and then driven back to the local funeral home chapel that would be located in their community. So, depending on where one lived, their body could be driven many miles to and fro before actually resting in a spot where mourners could view them and attend services. I'm sure the families of the dead never knew this, and probably assumed that their loved ones had remained at the funeral home where the service took place. I hope this description painted a nice little picture of my job and the activities I participated in each day. Have a good day. Hospital body removals. One of our jobs as removal staff personnel at the funeral home was to pick up the deceased at the area hospitals. The hospitals would call after getting the approval from the families of the deceased, and they would make arrangements with our funeral home. There were a variety of reasons why people died in hospitals: unsuccessful surgeries, heart attacks, or some prolonged illness that had finally taken its toll. Bodies in the hospital were always discreetly moved in the hospital morgue, which was generally located in the nondescript, out-of-the-way location in the hospital. All of the hospitals in our city had morgues with security codes for entry of some type, so if someone could figure out where the door to the morgue was located, they would not be able to just walk right in due to the security precautions. The morgues seldomly had anyone working in them, and I always remember being alone anytime I picked up a body, with the exception of a few hospitals that required a uniformed security guard to be present. The morgues often had walk-in coolers that held the deceased, or the big heavy rolling drawers where the bodies would lie. Sometimes the bodies were in body bags, and sometimes they were not. We were always required to drive our van up into the back of the alleyway of the hospital and were encouraged to wheel the deceased through areas that did not have many people around. I guess it was bad for business if people saw dead bodies being wheeled out of the hospital. But death is a reality at hospitals and often occurs daily. The procedures for removing a body from the hospital was like most of the other procedures, though there might be some extra paperwork involved. Hospitals always had their own way of tagging a corpse, but we would always re-tag them with our standard angle tag, which would have the deceased's name and an ID number that would correspond with all their funeral home paperwork. Oftentimes, the security guards would try to make small talk to lighten the mood. Often, they seemed uncomfortable with having to be assigned morgue duty. I always try to put them at ease by acting professional by doing my job as quickly as possible. Some guards would try not to look at the corpse, and some would be very interested in getting a good look. There were some hospitals with very nice morgues, but I remember most of them being less than nice and being dimly lit, not as clean as the rest of the hospital. I guess since only the dead would ever be in these rooms, it was less of a priority for them to spend money to make them nice. We would often know that a hospital pickup would be in our future because we would hear from the family shortly after the person died. But it was not until we received the official call from the hospital after the body had been released that we could actually go pick them up. Sometimes it might be a day or two after the person had died. I'm not always sure why sometimes it took so much longer, but in some cases it had to do whether or not an autopsy had to be required. One time I actually went to pick up a body at a very busy hospital and was told the body was in the ER. A man had come in with chest pains and had ended up having a heart attack right there in the ER. He died in the hospital, but it was so busy they insisted that I simply remove him from the ER instead of them taking him to their morgue. This made it very awkward for me since I had to park right in front of the ER doors and remove his body in a much less private setting. Everyone there saw me come in, and then they saw me wheel him out the door into the parking lot. It was not discreet, and honestly it did not seem very professional, but it was what the hospital asked me to do, so I guess I had no choice. It was the only time that ever happened. All the other times, I simply picked them up from the morgues. Mrs. Bates. It was a normal day at work. I arrived at my customary time of 7:30 a.m. to find the prep room bustling with energy as the others on my team were busily preparing for the day's work. Located just inside the prep room door was a large dry eraser board with columns. The information written on the board included the name of the deceased, and the type of casket they were to be placed in, and the funeral home location where the service was to be held. The most important piece of information was the time when the body had to be delivered and ready for showtime. On this particular day, there were 3 cases that all fell within 20 minutes of one another on the time schedule. This meant that we would all have to hustle to get the bodies prepped and delivered in time. I was assigned Mrs. Bates. Now, Mrs. Bates was a 82-year-old woman who had passed away in a nursing home only 2 days before. I had actually been the one to pick her up from the nursing home where she had died in her sleep. Still laying in her bed, her mouth was agape and her eyes were glazed over. She looked as though she had been in mid-snore when she took her last breath. Using the bedsheet she was lying upon, I fashioned her body into a cocoon and gently slid her into the gurney. I placed another sheet on top of her and finished up by placing a large blue cloth on top of that. I quickly rolled her to the van and loaded her up. She did not have many personal effects, and the nursing home staff had told me that she had very, very little family. And 2 days later, after she had been in a cooler, then been embalmed for burial, she laid ready to be dressed and prepared for the service. It turns out that she did have a distant relative who wanted to see that she got a proper burial and had managed to locate a teal and 1970s style dress for her. As was often the case, she looked better in death than she did in life due to her declining health in the nursing home. I was working with Todd the day that we got her ready for the burial. We had several other tasks that day, so getting her prepped was to be done as quickly as possible. We started by putting on her bra, then her panties, and a slip that accompanies the outfit. We used a roll technique to put on the bra. One of us would take one arm and pull her towards us, rolling her on her side as the other would tuck the bra underneath. Then we would trade and roll her on her other side and fasten the bra from behind. Mrs. Bates was fairly lightweight, so this was no problem. Often, large people were difficult to roll, sometimes taking several tries. Next, we buttoned her white shirt in the front and we cut the back down the middle. Next, we had to put on her skirt. The skirt, underwear, and slip were slid up her legs and under her bottom. One of us would take her legs and pull them up towards her torso, just slightly lifting her buttocks up off the table. This made it easier to get the skirt on. We found that skirts, etc. stayed on better if we actually put them on and did not cut them. Next, we buttoned the leisure suit style jacket in the front and cut the back up the middle. We placed it on top of the dress shirt. Next, a lady named Becky came in to fix her hair and did her makeup. Becky was a hired beautician who came in each day and fixed hair for the woman. Once she was finished, we lifted Mrs. Bates into her casket. Her family member had chosen a white and pink casket called the Prime Rose. Todd and I lifted her gently and placed her into the casket. Since she was lightweight, we were able to lift her. Once she was in her casket, we tucked the clothes tightly around her back and positioned her hands folded on her stomach. We closed the casket and rolled it out to our van. We loaded the van and drove her about 15 miles to the funeral chapel where her service would be held. We unloaded the casket, rolled it into the chapel, and parked it up front. Our job from here was to make sure everything was perfect for the viewing and funeral. The next ones to see her would be the family. So we would straighten her outfit, adjust her hair if needed, and place flowers around the casket. We would also check for leaks, or what they call purging, which simply meant any fluids escaping from the body. This was a very seldom thing to happen because our embalmers were very good at their jobs. Our work with Mrs. Bates was now finished. I had been with her since the nursing home and was now leaving her for her family. This was one of many, many days that I worked in a funeral home. Tons of torso. One day in the prep room, I was told by my boss to go to the parking lot to help unload large boxes from a large refrigerated semi. I was unsure as to the contents, but later learned that the boxes contained torsos of dead people who had donated their body to science. The torsos were packed in a large styrofoam packaging and were only about a day old. This meant that the people who the torsos belonged to had only been dead for about 24 hours. During the past 24 hours, the head, arms, and legs were removed and packaged for shipping. Why, you may ask? Well, each of the torsos had to be selected to be used at a convention for back surgeons. The medical company had hired our funeral home to transport the torsos and set them up on the mock operating tables. It was here that surgeons from all over the country would practice on the torsos. Of all the death, smells, and sights I had seen in my short career in the prep room, this was the worst. The smell was horrendous, much like that of a slaughterhouse with fresh meat that had been butchered. Essentially, that is exactly what this was. I loaded my van with a few torsos and drove it over to a local hotel ballroom where the convention was taking place. I could not help but think of how odd and sick it was that I was wheeling in butchered torsos into a nice hotel. Of course, no one knew what I had in the boxes. The torsos were all from overweight people, which was actually part of the new procedure experiment. The torsos were extremely heaved, flabby, bloody, and gross. I could almost not stand seeing or smelling them as I lifted them and positioned them on the operating tables. Each table was set up with an operating light, trays of utensils and plastic bags, and a hazardous waste trash can. Each table had been placed on top of thick plastic so no blood or guts stained the pretty hotel ballroom carpet. There were several of us from the prep room working on this assignment. There were probably about 15 torsos. It had never occurred to me that doctors practiced their crafts on cadavers, even though I had seen my fair share of movies where this was the case. What was most shocking to me was the fact that the bodies had been mutilated for the purpose of experimentation. It seemed rather odd to me that only a day ago these were living human beings, all of which had no idea their torsos would be in another state, in a hotel ballroom, on an operating table. How bizarre is that? It took me about a week to get that smell out of my nose, and about the same amount of time to get the images out of my mind. Even the most seasoned prep room employee had never seen anything like this and found it repulsive. And there you have it, monsters. For some reason on that last story I was thinking of Thanksgiving turkey. Maybe it has something to do with the torso and the turkey, I don't know. What do you guys think? Well, monsters, I hope you enjoy these stories. And be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so and become a monster today. Also, I really like to hear your comments and also leave some likes and share the video. If you like to keep up with what's going on in between videos, be sure to check us out on Twitter at YeahManTV.com. Thank you so much, monsters, for watching the video, and like always, till next time.